On a quiet spring morning in Zurich, plainclothes police officers walked into one of the most luxurious hotels in Switzerland. They weren't there for a wedding or a business conference. They were there to arrest the most powerful men in world football. Within hours, some of FIFA's most senior officials were in handcuffs, extradition papers were being drawn up, and an organization that controlled the single most popular sport on the planet was staring down the barrel of a criminal investigation, usually reserved for organized crime syndicates. This is the story of how FIFA, the governing body behind the World Cup, the tournament that unites billions of people every 4 years, became the target of the FBI. This is the story of bribes, secret bank accounts, a president who thought he was untouchable, and the 20-year conspiracy that finally caught up with him. Before we dive in, let's set the stage. FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, isn't just a sports league. It's one of the most powerful non-governmental organizations on Earth. It decides who hosts the World Cup. It controls billions of dollars in broadcasting rights, sponsorship deals, and marketing contracts. And for nearly 2 decades, at the very top of that organization, sat a man named Sepp Blatter. To understand how deep this scandal went, we need to understand the culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. A culture where votes could be bought, tournaments could be sold to the highest bidder, and nobody outside a small circle of insiders ever really knew where the money went. So let's rewind the clock and walk through exactly how the most popular sport in the world became the stage for one of the largest corruption cases in the history of organized sport. Every scandal has an origin story, and this one doesn't actually start with Sepp Blatter. It starts with his predecessor, a Brazilian lawyer named João Havelange, who became FIFA president in 1974. Havelange is often credited with modernizing FIFA, turning a relatively modest sporting federation into a global commercial powerhouse by opening the door to major corporate sponsorship for the first time. But that transformation came with a cost. Havelange built close relationships with a marketing agency called International Sport and Leisure, or ISL, which handled FIFA's television and marketing rights for years. Long after Havelange left office, investigators discovered that ISL had secretly paid millions of dollars in kickbacks to FIFA officials, including, according to a Swiss criminal investigation years later, to Havelange himself, in exchange for favorable contracts. ISL eventually collapsed into bankruptcy in 2001, but the culture it helped create at FIFA, a culture where commercial contracts and personal enrichment quietly blurred together, never really went away. It simply got passed down to the next generation of leadership. That next generation included a young technical director named Sepp Blatter, who had joined FIFA's staff in 1975 and spent over 20 years climbing the internal ladder before being elected president himself in 1998. Blatter didn't invent the system. He inherited it. But under his leadership, it would grow larger, more global, and eventually impossible to hide. If you wanted to understand where the corruption actually lived day to day, you didn't look at FIFA's glossy Zurich headquarters. You looked at the regional confederations that fed into it. FIFA is structured almost like a federation of federations. 6 regional confederations, each controlling blocks of votes, each wielding enormous influence over who becomes FIFA president and which countries get chosen to host the World Cup. At the center of one of those confederations, CONCACAF, governing North and Central America and the Caribbean, sat a man named Jack Warner. A former schoolteacher from Trinidad, Warner rose over decades to become one of the most powerful men in world football, a kingmaker whose support was considered essential for anyone hoping to win a FIFA presidential election. World Cup hosting bids courted him directly, because whoever controlled Warner's loyalty effectively controlled a critical block of votes. Alongside Warner was Chuck Blazer, an American sports marketing executive who served as CONCACAF's general secretary for over 20 years. Blazer lived an extraordinary lifestyle. Investigators would later detail a private apartment maintained at Trump Tower in New York, reportedly used partly to house his cats, funded through commissions and kickbacks, skimmed from sponsorship and broadcasting deals negotiated on CONCACAF's behalf. Over in South America, CONMEBOL had its own long-serving power broker, Nicolás Leos of Paraguay, who led the confederation for a staggering 27 years and was later accused of accepting millions in bribes tied to marketing rights deals stretching back to the 1990s. These weren't isolated bad actors working alone. Investigators would later describe an entire ecosystem. Officials across multiple continents who had normalized bribery as simply the cost of doing business. Marketing rights got sold under the table. Hosting votes got quietly purchased. Loyalty got rewarded with cash. And because FIFA operated more like a closed political system than a public institution, with no shareholders demanding transparency, no independent regulator looking over its shoulder, nobody outside that small circle had any real way of knowing how deep it went. Here's where the story takes its first major turn, and it's a twist almost nobody in football saw coming. Chuck Blazer, the same man who had spent decades allegedly enriching himself through the system, became the unlikely key to bringing the entire operation down. By the early 2000s, American authorities had been quietly building a case against Blazer for years, focused initially on unpaid taxes tied to the millions he'd allegedly pocketed through his CONCACAF role. Facing potential decades in prison on tax evasion and racketeering charges, Blazer made a decision that would trigger the biggest scandal in FIFA's history. He agreed to cooperate. Starting in late 2011, Blazer began secretly working with the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service, wearing a hidden recording device to capture conversations with fellow football officials, including, notably, during the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, where FIFA and Confederation figures gathered informally alongside the games. What Blazer handed prosecutors wasn't just evidence against himself. It was a roadmap into a much larger network, one that stretched from the Caribbean to South America, to the very structure of how World Cup hosting decisions got made. For nearly 4 years, this investigation stayed almost entirely hidden from public view. Football fans around the world had no idea that behind the scenes, federal agents were quietly building what would become one of the largest cases the Department of Justice had ever built against an international sports organization. Now we arrive at the moment that changed everything. It was May 27, 2015, just days before FIFA's presidential election, where Sepp Blatter was seeking his 5th consecutive term. Football officials from around the world had gathered in Zurich for FIFA's annual Congress, many staying at the 5-star Boro Lac Hotel, one of the most exclusive addresses in Switzerland, where a single night in the top suite has been reported to cost more than $10,000. In the early morning hours, Swiss police, acting on a formal request from United States authorities, entered the hotel and arrested 7 FIFA officials directly from their rooms. In a detail that captured the surreal nature of the moment, the arrested men were reportedly escorted out through a service entrance in an attempt to avoid the press already gathering outside. But the story broke almost instantly. Images of football executives being quietly led away by Swiss police from one of the most luxurious hotels in Europe became the defining image of the entire scandal. That same day, the United States Department of Justice unsealed a sweeping indictment. 14 people, 9 of them current or former FIFA officials, were charged with racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering conspiracies spanning more than 2 decades. Then Attorney General Loretta Lynch described a conspiracy involving more than $150 million in bribes tied to media and marketing rights for football tournaments across the Americas, calling it corruption that was, in her words, rampant, systemic, and deep-rooted both abroad and here in the United States. The scale of the allegations was staggering. Prosecutors described a system where officials had accepted bribes in exchange for media rights to tournaments, votes on hosting decisions, and marketing contracts. Payments funneled through shell companies and offshore bank accounts specifically designed to hide the money trail from regulators for decades. Here's the part of the story that still stuns people today. Despite the arrests dominating headlines just days before FIFA's presidential vote, Sepp Blatter stood before the FIFA Congress and was re-elected to a fifth term. He addressed the scandal directly, insisting FIFA would move past the controversy, framing himself as the steady hand needed to guide the organization through crisis, the same message he'd used to weather every previous storm during his 17 years in charge. On June 2, 2015, just 4 days after winning re-election, Sepp Blatter stood before the press and announced he would resign as FIFA president. He wasn't personally charged with a crime at that moment, but the walls were closing in fast. Reports emerged of a separate U.S. investigation focused specifically on Blatter's own conduct, and Swiss authorities had independently opened their own criminal proceedings, scrutinizing a suspicious payment Blatter had personally authorized years earlier. That payment, 2 million Swiss francs paid to Michel Platini, the president of European football's governing body UEFA, and at the time widely seen as the heir apparent to lead FIFA, would become its own scandal within the scandal. FIFA's own ethics investigators found no clear legal basis for the payment, which Blatter said was compensation for work Platini had done years earlier as a technical advisor. Both men were provisionally suspended from all football activity while the investigation played out. FIFA's Secretary General, Jérôme Valcke, was also removed from his position around the same time and later banned over entirely separate financial misconduct allegations, including claims tied to the resale of World Cup tickets. In the span of just a few months, 3 of the most powerful men in world football, Blatter, Platini, and Valcke, had all been forced out of the game. As the American case unfolded over the following years, the guilty pleas started coming in, one after another, each revealing another layer of just how systemic the corruption had become. Chuck Blazer, the whistleblower whose cooperation started it all, formally pleaded guilty to a stunning list of offenses, including admitting he'd accepted bribes tied to the selection of host nations for the 1998 and 2010 World Cups, confirming from the inside exactly the kind of vote-buying fans had long suspected, but could never prove. Jeffrey Webb, who had taken over as CONCACAF president, promising to clean up the Confederation after Warner's downfall, was himself indicted and later pleaded guilty, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on anyone following the case closely. Rafael Esquivel, Eduardo Lee, José María Marin, and a long list of Federation officials from across the Americas were swept up as the case expanded. Interpol issued international wanted notices for officials who had fled prosecution rather than face extradition. What made the case so extraordinary wasn't just its size, it was its legal structure. American prosecutors used the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO, the same legal framework historically used to dismantle organized crime families, to argue that FIFA's regional football bodies had effectively been operating as criminal enterprises for more than 2 decades. It was a stunning legal framing, treating a sports federation with the same tools once used against the mob. One of the most explosive threads running through the entire scandal was the question football fans around the world had been quietly asking for years. Were the World Cup hosting decisions themselves for sale? In December 2010, FIFA's Executive Committee awarded the 2018 World Cup to Russia, and in a single stunning announcement immediately afterward, awarded the 2022 tournament to Qatar. The Qatar decision, in particular, stunned football officials worldwide, given the country's small size, its blistering summer heat, and its almost complete lack of existing football infrastructure at the time of the bid. As the corruption case unfolded years later, American and Swiss investigators scrutinized whether votes on both hosting decisions had been influenced by bribery from competing bid committees. FIFA had actually commissioned its own internal investigation into the bidding process years before the American case became public, led by respected American attorney Michael Garcia. When FIFA ultimately released only a heavily condensed summary of Garcia's findings, rather than the full report itself, Garcia resigned from FIFA's Ethics Committee in protest, publicly calling the summary a materially incomplete representation of the actual findings his team had compiled. For many longtime observers, that single moment crystallized exactly what was wrong with FIFA's culture of secrecy. Even the organization's own internal watchdog couldn't get the full truth released. To be clear, no World Cup hosting decision has ever been formally overturned as a result of this case, but the shadow of those allegations followed both tournaments for years, and it became a major driving force behind FIFA, pushing through sweeping bidding reforms for future World Cups, including the transparent, publicly scored bidding process that would eventually select the United States, Mexico, and Canada to jointly host the 2026 tournament, a process explicitly designed from the ground up to avoid any repeat of the secrecy that surrounded 2010. With Blatter gone, FIFA needed a leader who could credibly claim to represent a clean break from the old regime. In February 2016, at a special elective congress in Zurich, Gianni Infantino, a Swiss-Italian lawyer who had spent years working as UEFA's general secretary, was elected FIFA's new president on a platform built almost entirely around the word reform. Infantino's early FIFA moved quickly to distance itself from the scandal era. The organization created an independent audit and compliance committee with outside oversight. It introduced integrity checks and term limits for top officials, hoping to prevent any single figure from accumulating the kind of unchecked, decades-long influence Blatter, Warner, and Leoz once held. For the first time in FIFA's history, executive salaries were published publicly, and the organization formally separated its commercial decision-making from its political governance structures, reducing the concentration of power that had allowed the original scandal to fester for so long undetected. Meanwhile, the legal fallout from the American case continued unfolding for years after Blatter's resignation. In December 2017, the Department of Justice unsealed additional charges against more officials, bringing the total number of individuals and entities charged in the case to well over 40. Trials, sentencing hearings, and asset forfeiture proceedings stretched on for the better part of a decade, ultimately recovering well over $200 million in ill-gotten gains, much of which has since been redirected back into football development programs around the world as part of victim restitution efforts. The story didn't end with the American prosecution. In Switzerland, Blatter and Platini were formally indicted in 2020 over that same disputed 2 million franc payment, and the case finally went to trial in the summer of 2022, 7 years after Blatter's original resignation. In a result that surprised many longtime observers, both men were ultimately acquitted by the Swiss Federal Criminal Court in 2022, which found insufficient evidence to prove the payment had been fraudulent beyond reasonable doubt. Prosecutors appealed the verdict, and the legal proceedings around that specific payment continued grinding on for years afterward, a reminder of just how slowly institutional accountability can move, even when the initial allegations first surfaced back in 2015. Despite the criminal acquittal, both men have remained banned from FIFA-related activity as a result of the organization's own, separate internal ethics rulings, a distinction worth understanding. A criminal court found insufficient evidence of fraud under Swiss law. FIFA's own ethics committee, operating under a different standard entirely, still concluded the payment violated football's internal governance rules. 2 systems, 2 standards, 2 very different outcomes, both technically true at the same time. While prosecutors built their case inside courtrooms, an entirely different reckoning was playing out in public. FIFA's major corporate sponsors, companies that had spent decades attaching their brands to the World Cup's global reach, suddenly found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Visa issued an unusually blunt public statement, expressing dismay over the allegations and stating that FIFA needed to enact fundamental reforms if it wanted to keep its trust. Other longtime partners, including Coca-Cola and Adidas, issued similar statements calling for change, a rare moment of major global brands publicly pressuring one of their own marketing partners rather than quietly distancing themselves. Journalists who had spent years chasing rumors of FIFA corruption, often dismissed, mocked, or threatened with legal action for their reporting, suddenly found their earlier work vindicated in real time. Investigative reporters and authors who had published books alleging exactly this kind of systemic bribery years before the arrests watched, as federal indictments confirmed allegations they'd been making since the early 2000s, often to skeptical audiences who assumed the claims were exaggerated. The public reaction, meanwhile, was a strange mix of shock and vindication. Shock because most casual fans had no idea the organization behind their favorite tournament operated anything like what the indictments described. Vindication because for the football community's more cynical corners, the arrest simply confirmed what many had suspected for years, that hosting decisions, marketing contracts, and the sport's governing structure had long operated by a very different set of rules than the game itself. Nearly a decade on from the original arrests, it's worth asking, what actually changed and what didn't? On the legal side, the American case is effectively complete. Nearly every individual charged either pleaded guilty, was convicted at trial, or remains a fugitive from justice, with several former officials still living under Interpol red notices, unable to travel freely without risking arrest and extradition. The financial penalties, forfeitures, and restitution orders tied to the case reshaped how sports federations think about financial oversight far beyond football alone, influencing governance reforms discussed in other major international sporting bodies in the years since. On the institutional side, FIFA under Gianni Infantino has weathered its own share of controversy since 2016, from criticism over Infantino's compensation and use of private jets, to renewed scrutiny over human rights conditions tied to the 2022 Qatar World Cup, to debates over FIFA's rapid expansion of the tournament format, leading into the 2026 edition, hosted across the United States, Mexico, and Canada. None of these controversies mirror the scale of the original 2015 case, but they're a reminder that reform is rarely a single moment. It's an ongoing, imperfect process, tested by every major decision an organization this large continues to make. What's undeniable is this: the FIFA that exists today operates under a level of public scrutiny, financial transparency, and external accountability that would have been almost unthinkable under Sepp Blatter's 17-year presidency. Whether that's enough to prevent the next scandal remains, as it always does with power this concentrated, an open question. It's worth pausing on something the headlines and the indictments often flatten out. This wasn't a victimless, purely financial crime confined to boardrooms. Every dollar allegedly skimmed off marketing contracts and hosting bids was, in theory, money that could have gone toward developing football infrastructure in smaller, poorer footballing nations, many of which are exactly the countries whose federation votes were allegedly being bought in the first place. Consider the irony at the heart of CONCACAF's corruption. Specifically, this was a confederation covering some of the poorest football federations on earth, nations across the Caribbean with tiny budgets, aging facilities, and limited youth development programs. And yet, according to the indictments, tens of millions of dollars meant to flow through that confederation's marketing and sponsorship deals were instead allegedly diverted into the personal accounts of the very officials entrusted to grow the game there. For every luxury apartment or offshore account investigators uncovered, there was, implicitly, a youth academy that never got built, or a national team that never got proper training facilities. This is part of why so many football administrators and reform advocates pushed so hard in the years after 2015 for real structural change rather than simply replacing one set of leaders with another. The concern was never just about a handful of corrupt individuals. It was about whether the system itself, left unreformed, would simply produce the next Jack Warner or the next Chuck Blazer a decade down the line, just with different names attached to the same old habits. Here are a handful of details from this case that even hardcore football fans often don't know. Chuck Blazer's cooperation with federal investigators wasn't just about handing over paperwork. He wore a hidden recording device disguised inside a keychain to secretly capture conversations with fellow officials, including during the 2012 London Olympics, conversations that later became key evidence presented in court. Prosecutors' use of the RICO Act, a legal framework built in the 1970s, specifically to dismantle organized crime families, had, before this case, almost never been applied to an international sports governing body, making the legal strategy itself almost as unprecedented as the scandal it targeted. Investigators found that several bribe payments had been funneled through bank accounts with deliberately mundane, innocuous names, specifically designed to blend into ordinary international business transactions and avoid triggering anti-money laundering red flags for years at a stretch. And perhaps the strangest detail of all, several of the officials implicated in the case had, for years, sat on FIFA's own internal ethics and integrity committees, the very bodies theoretically responsible for policing exactly this kind of misconduct within the organization. It's easy to watch a story like this and think of it as a distant scandal involving suits, spreadsheets, and Swiss bank accounts, far removed from the sport you actually watch on the pitch. But this case fundamentally changed how the World Cup gets awarded, how FIFA spends and discloses its money, and how much scrutiny international sports governance now receives from journalists, fans, and federal law enforcement agencies thousands of miles from Zurich. Every time you watch a World Cup today, you're watching a tournament shaped, in part, by the reforms born directly out of this scandal. Transparent, publicly scored bidding processes, published financial disclosures, and an institution that, however imperfectly, has been forced to operate under a level of scrutiny it spent decades successfully avoiding. Understanding this story isn't just about football history. It's about understanding how power, money, and accountability collide, even at the very top of the sport that unites the entire planet every 4 years. From a young technical director in the 1970s to the most powerful man in world football, Sepp Blatter's rise and eventual fall remains one of the most dramatic downfalls in modern sports history. But he was never alone in it. Behind him stood a sprawling network of officials across multiple continents who, for decades, treated football's governing bodies less like public institutions, accountable to the sport's billion-plus fans, and more like private empires accountable to no one. It took a whistleblower wearing a hidden wire, a coordinated international law enforcement operation spanning years, and painstaking, patient investigative work to finally expose it. FIFA has changed a great deal since 2015. New leadership, new oversight structures, new bidding rules. But the deeper questions this scandal raised about power, money, and who really gets held accountable at the top of global sport are still being asked today, every time a new controversy surfaces. If you found this investigation into football's biggest scandal fascinating, make sure to subscribe, because we're covering more of the sport's most controversial, hidden, and jaw-dropping true stories in the videos ahead. And let us know in the comments, do you think FIFA has genuinely cleaned up its act since 2015? Or is history simply waiting for the right moment to repeat itself?